Hola, everybody. Welcome to the Chats with Yvonne podcast with me, your host, Yvonne Armenta, where I talk about public speaking con cultura. Today, we're talking about what happens in the brain when we share stories. We know what it takes to share a powerful story. We know what it feels like in our bodies to be vulnerable and share that story. But what is actually happening in our brains when we're on stage sharing our story with an audience? I'm not a brain expert, obviously, by any means. I'm just someone that knows the power of the more you know. And so today I'd love to share a little bit of what I've been learning myself. And it started at Barnes and Nobles. I went to Barnes and Nobles one day to help me envision exactly where my public speaking con cultura practice prompts will be. I'm manifesting, which by the way, I post updates on their release on Instagram, but my email subscribers will get a first look at them today and be able to shop them today, actually, as you're listening to this podcast episode before they officially open up to the public on August 1st. Well, like Barnes and Nobles does, it inspires you to dive into all of their book sections. Like every single book section, I just want to go in there, even if it's genres that I don't generally go for. And I don't know if this is a me thing or porque crecí low income, but I always start at the clearance section and make my way to the rest of the stands later. It's sort of I guess you could call it girl math, where I'm like, well, if I start back there and I get this many books, technically I get more for my money. If I find a book there, I'm less likely to spend on the more expensive books and maybe can go check those out at the library or whatever it is. That's just the way that I think. I do that when I go to Ross. I do it when I go to Marshall's. I do it when I go to every single store. Probably not the grocery store though. Anyway, I found the book Essentials of the Brain, an Introductory Guide for $10, and I had to get it. In my work as a consultant and workshop facilitator, it's important for me to learn everything I can and stay updated with ways that I can help you love the art of public speaking and practice it a tu manera. I won't ever use something I learn in a book and claim to be an expert in it or that I am qualified to teach it, but I will use that information to inform my approaches to sharing information because my entire foundation is meeting you where you are and adapting to your preferred way of receiving information to in turn help you really love the art of public speaking. So, we know the power of a great story. We know what it feels like to get the chills from someone passionately sharing a piece of themselves with us. But what does it feel like for you? And what is actually happening in our brains, both our own as a speaker and in our connection with the audience? How are we able to make those connections with our audience? And I'm going to start off with reading an excerpt from the book. So, the process of speaking. We have a structured grammar that allows for complex ideas and abstractions to be communicated. It allows for the transmission of ideas in a nearly infinite number of ways compared to the finite number of single words available for use. And this is because we have the rules of grammar, nouns, verbs, modifiers, etc. And language, for that very reason, to me is so beautiful, right? There's not one way of telling your story. Matter of fact, you can tell your story one way and then the next day tell it a different way. Y lo puedes decir en español y de repente lo dices en inglés y se siente diferente. The beautiful thing about the process of speaking is that we do indeed have so many ways of communicating available to us, both in the spoken word, but also in the way that we move our bodies, in the eye contact or not that we make, right? And if you think about this process of speaking as someone that is bilingual, think about that experience. You have grammar available times two, right? Like you have so much language and ways of communicating available to us that telling a story becomes, to me, I think, a more immersive experience and even more of a connector. And it's why storytelling is so incredibly important. We've been doing it forever. It's how we pass down knowledge in our families and our units. It's how we learn to exist within the world, for better or for worse. It's how we learn about nuestras mamás y cuando llegaron a los Estados Unidos, what their story was like. I always loved hearing stories from my grandma because They taught me things about my mom that I never actually had access to directly from my mom, or even here in the States, because we live such a, you know, tenemos que ir para acá. Oh, ahora el trabajo, ahora esto, ahora lo otro. So stories become so powerful because they give us key information, but they also make us feel, right? And just as a fun fact, for most people, the language functions are dependent on structures in the left hemisphere of the brain. And a model that the book brings up to understand language is the Wernicke-Geschwind model. Perdónenme, no sé decir ese nombre. Wernicke's area of the brain, that's what it's called, is important in the decoding of receptive language. A classic theory describes the brain structures involved in expressive language, receptive language, and reading is the Wernicke-Geschwind model. So, according to this model, a person having a conversation will experience activation of the primary auditory cortex when hearing another person speak. This leads to activation of Wernicke's area, where spoken language and written language is processed. When one wishes to respond to the other person, Wernicke's area generates the neural representation of the thought or reply and sends it to the Broca's area by way of a nerve tract known as the arcuate fasciculus. Oh my God, no sé decir eso. That connects Wernicke's area to Broca's area. Broca's area activates the appropriate articulation for the response and sends it to the neurons that drive the appropriate muscles of speech in the primary motor cortex, the area of the brain that controls movement. Then the person responds. Isn't that crazy to think that all of that happens, or for the most part happens in our brains when we are reacting or waiting to respond, right? Or listening, right? I think it's so interesting that so many of us, well, me, for example, as an introvert and someone that has just a tiny bit of some social anxiety. I don't know if that's the right term to use here, but I often overthink my conversations with folks in social interactions, especially for the first time. And I have wanted to make it a point to say, okay, let me really listen to this person and not worry about responding, but really feel and understand what they're saying. And it's really, really hard. And obviously, I'm just interpreting what I'm reading here, right? But I'm like, gosh, if on top of me being an overthinker, all of this is happening in my brain, like my brain is sort of meant to respond. My brain is sort of listening to respond anyway already. So I don't know. I have to do a little bit more research on this to figure out good listening tips and tools, but especially and most importantly in those social interactions. In my public speaking consulting work, and when it comes to, hey, let me really listen to the person on stage and their story, I have no problems with just sitting there and taking all of that beautiful information in. But I think it's the idea of when I have to respond or know that I'm expected to respond that I worry too much about my response and not internalizing what they're actually saying. And I thought I would share this part here too, because, Wernicke's area of the brain is not only for speaking, but also the reading portion. And so I want to share this. It says, when a person is reading, the signal received by the primary visual cortex is transmitted to the left angular gyrus in the parietal lobe. Oh my gosh. If someone's a science person out there or a STEM person or a brain expert, y'all are going to laugh at me. Pero bueno, here the visual form of the word is translated into an auditory code and then transmitted to Wernicke's area for comprehension. If you were reading aloud, this information would be transmitted back to Broca's area and the previously described process would continue. So reading, why? So this right here is kind of interesting because when you're telling your story, right? Think about the TED Talks of the world. They don't always have words on their screen unless it's to make a point, maybe a quote that they're saying, right? Or maybe the title slide, for example. But they rarely have really any slides. You'll probably see them change a slide maybe 4 times unless they're showing you some graphics on specific data, right? But this is so important when telling your story. You want to keep the attention on you and your words, right? Because our brains as audience members are trying to process both what you're saying and at the same time what we're reading on the screen. So it's so important not to have words on your slides for those very important portions of your story. And if within your story you want to share facts and want to share faces of people that amplify what you're saying, you could totally do that. But let's say in that TED Talk, you would always recommend folks to not have words on the screen if possible. So, that is just a little portion of essentials of the brain, an introductory guide, and what it has to say about the way that we speak and processing speech. So, I want to also share additional ways that our brains, like what happens in our brains when we are telling these stories and when people are hearing them, right? So storytelling actually engages multiple regions of our brain. It's the sensory experiences, the emotions, the memory. This makes an experience immersive and engaging. And I think, right, and I know storytelling to be so incredibly powerful because it activates all of it's science, y'all. It's not, no es solo cosa del corazón. It's science. We are activating all of these different brain regions when we're telling a story ourselves, right? Because when you're telling the story, you are reliving it. And at the same time, we're activating those same regions for our audience. So storytelling, I'm nerding out about this because then storytelling becomes so much more than just your immediate presence on stage and maybe the first few people that you can see in the audience. Storytelling is quite literally triggering an experience, a feeling, an emotion, a memory, a sense to your audience. And that right there can really transform the way that you tell stories. If you tap into your senses, it can completely transform the way that you tell your story and the impact that you make. In my storytelling workshops, I tell folks to tap into their senses when they're thinking about how do I tell this story or what do I tell? Right? How do I immerse people? Besides telling, it's not just telling, it's immersing people, it's engaging them. How do we do that? Tapping into our senses. What can I see? What can I smell in that very specific moment? Is there anything that I touched? What did my heart feel like? Were my legs shaking? What did the environment smell like? I don't know why. One of the examples that I always bring up is the smell of wet wood chips or soil, because that is, fun fact, one of my favorite smells. No sé por qué. But in that moment, I'm not going to say, oh, it smelled like wet wood chips or it smelled like wet soil. I can create even a story around that. I can instead add certain details that add to the story, right? Like, how did the soil get wet? The mist of the morning, maybe. How did the soil even get there? Placed there gently by Yvonne, right? Placed there gently by me the day before because I knew the weather. There are details that when you tap into those different senses and what you can actually see, smell, touch in the moment, in the particular story that you want to tell, you not only become more engaged, but you allow your audience to become more engaged in what you're telling. And then there's the release of neurochemicals. So again, this is something that I am learning about, and I will leave some of the articles that I read through to really come up with these things in the description of this podcast episode. So check those out if you're interested in diving deeper into it. If you're a nerd like me, take a look at them. Take a look at the articles if you want to learn a little bit more and dive a little bit deeper. So I'm just going to go through some of the neurochemicals that are released when we tell stories. First up is oxytocin. This is often called the bonding hormone. It's also known as a love hormone. Oxytocin is released during storytelling, especially when stories evoke empathy and connection. We foster trust and emotional bonding, and these types of stories make us feel more human. It's why maybe you can't help but cry on stage every time you tell a story, because that story is reminding you, it's bonding you again, once again, to that moment, to that person, to that place and time that you're in. And I have so often gotten the question of, Yvonne, how do I stop myself from crying on stage? I want to tell my story efficiently, effectively. There are moments when maybe you getting emotional on stage may feel like it's distracting from what you're saying and not making the point. But think about the release of this neurochemical that's actually happening when you're storytelling and what it might mean for your audience to see you get emotional on stage and as a result connect even more to the story that you're telling, to the point that you're making, and make an impact in their lives that much more. Crying is not a bad thing. Crying is not a loss of efficiency. Crying doesn't mean that you're going to be less of a speaker. Crying doesn't mean that you are less efficient in your communication. It can sometimes mean that you're making an even deeper connection. And I will also say that the more you tell this story, that particular story, the easier it gets. The better you are at managing those emotions, I'll call them, because you know what's coming. And so now I think, again, I had have to do more research on this, but then the oxytocin that's released, right, from telling that story, if you keep repeating it and repeating and repeating it to some capacity, maybe you become not numb to it. That's not the right word because you never become numb to your own story, but you're more practiced in telling it. And therefore, it becomes more of a habit, and your brain almost might not be able to register it, or your brain doesn't register it as something like a peak emotion, because it's no longer a peak emotion because you've rehearsed it and it's a habit that you have built. And so it doesn't require so much of your emotional capacity. Again, that's just my own thinking. I don't have an article to back that up, but if anybody out there has any articles to back that up or is like, hey, Vaughn, you're completely wrong. But that's sort of how I think about it when you're on stage. It's, oye, estoy llorando porque es la primera vez that I'm telling this story. And the more comfortable I get telling the story and the more often I tell this, that emotion is no longer going to be at its peak. But when I start telling a different story and another story, I see, a lo mejor voy a volver a llorar. And it's going to be a process that you go through each and every time. Then we have dopamine. Dopamine is often called the dope chemical because it activates learning systems, causes arousal or pleasure, and helps us with focus, memory, and motivation. So, this particular neurochemical helps us enjoy stories and feel pleasure and excitement within the story. There's an emotional arc. Maybe there's a resolution in your story you told, and people are feeling excited about it. They're like, yes, this is the ending that I wanted. You know, dopamine actually helps us remember details more accurately. So when you tap into your senses and embed emotions into your story, you're helping people remember the details of your story more accurately. That is incredibly important. And having them remember every single detail is not as important as them remembering what your lesson is, what your takeaway is. When you think about dopamine helping us remember details more accurately, it's because we've attached these emotions of pleasure and excitement to something that you said in particular. Think about an example that you have of when you've been in the audience and then someone says something and maybe it has nothing to do with, well, it has something to do with what they were talking about, but maybe it has little to do with what they were talking about and more to do with how they said something or the emotion that they used while saying something that makes you remember that particular moment in their speech. And therefore, you feel connected to them because of that particular moment. Then we have endorphins. These are the feel good chemicals that can be released when a story evokes positive emotions. And maybe it's laughter, like you're funny, right? So, trying to include these funny moments, these happy moments, these embarrassing moments, or something just a little unexpected within your stories triggers those endorphins in your audience and it makes people feel more at ease. Think about how a giggle just makes you feel more at ease. A laugh makes you feel at ease. I always say this story because this is actually one of my most embarrassing stories ever. O sea, no, I don't think that I can live this one down. But I was in middle school and my friend had begged me to join the basketball team because they needed one more person to be able to have a complete team to be able to compete y toda la cosa. I do not play basketball. I'm good at knockout. I'm great at horse, I think, but I don't do basketball. Like I'm just not that great. And at the time, I didn't really know the rules either. I grew up playing soccer. Pero bueno, my friend Avalon, she can convince you of anything. So I joined and we made it to the championship game. It was down to us and one other team, and it was the final game. I really didn't have I was just, honestly, I was just standing out on the court. O sea, no hacía nada. Sí corría. I would pass the ball and all that. I'd go to all of our practices and stuff. But really, I wasn't there because I loved it. I wasn't there because I was good at it. I was there because I was like, we just need an extra person, and I'm going to be the extra person. So, anyway, towards the end of the game, there's very few seconds left, right? I grab the ball and I'm dribbling down the court, and I hear people yelling at me like, "Yeah, Yvonne, Yvonne," right? And I'm like, "Oh, hell yeah, I'm about to make this," right? And I go, I shoot, and I make it, and then I look over to my left, and the other team's the other team's team started cheering, and I was like, What happened?" I turned around and my team was like, "No, Yvonne, you shot it on the wrong court, like the wrong basket." I was like, "Oh my God." Because at this point we had switched, in basketball, you switch sides, and that hadn't processed for me. So anyway, I lost us the championship game because I scored for the other team. And I was crying because I was so embarrassed, and I clearly remember crying, and my friend Avalon consoling me and, just hugging me and stuff. She's like, "It's okay, it's okay." I was like, "No, it's not." Bien chillona. I'm a Cancer. What do you expect? And also a people pleaser. So I was like, I cannot believe that I did that. Looking back now, it's kind of funny, but at the moment, it really wasn't. And then, pa acabarla de chingar, my brother was on the other side of this window, but I could see him, right? Like he was on the other side of this window and he was pointing at me and laughing. And I looked at him and started bawling even more because I was so freaking embarrassed. Anyway, I that is one of the most embarrassing moments that I've ever had in my life. And mostly because I was like, oh my gosh, I just didn't know the rules. I made just that whole moment, I still replay it in my mind. Like when I tell it in person, I even adopt, I have this confident dribble. I'm like, damn, I'm about to make this, right? There's things that come alive when I'm telling this particular story because I tap into my senses, both what my body was physically doing in the moment so that I can reenact it almost for my audience, not in this dramatic way, but in a way that allows them to see what it was like to be there. I even make myself shorter because I was younger, right? I was in middle school. These are all little details that might make people find a moment humorous, or a little just unexpected, right? There's a storyline, but when you think about telling it on stage, think about these different aspects and the senses that you can tap into while you're telling the story. What did you see? Like me, I saw my brother. He's on the right side of me as I was walking down that little aisle of shame, I call it, and he was on the other side making fun of me. And you know what is crazy? I think this was one of the very first times that my family was able to come to my games because they were always at a weird time where my mom, I think, wasn't out of work yet or no sé. But anyway, so funny, humorous moments can make people feel more at ease, meaning through your story. And even when you are telling your story yourself, that moment when if I tell that story and I get a reaction from folks, a giggle or no sé, they clap for me or they cheer for me or something, right? In that moment after telling that story, it's going to make me as a speaker feel more at ease. Like, okay, I have a connection with my audience there already. Okay. And there's two more things because I don't want to make this episode crazy long, but there's two more things that I want to talk about and that I thought was really, really interesting. So there's something called synchronization of brain activity. And there's research that shows that the brain activity of the storyteller and the listener can become synchronized. This is known as neural coupling, which means that both brains can exhibit similar patterns of activity, enhancing communication and understanding. Like when you're telling a story, you could basically almost like merge brains with your audience member, with the person that's receiving the story, and have similar reactions. And when you have those similar reactions, think about how impactful your connection can be. For example, si yo empiezo a llorar while I'm on stage because I'm telling my story and I see someone else crying as well, maybe we'll bond over that, right? We'll bond over it because we had this moment of crying. And now I know that the way that the story is impacting me as I'm telling it might also be impacting someone else. And the neurochemicals that are being activated in my brain as I'm telling the story are the same ones that are being activated in my audience members. And that creates such a deep connection. I'm going to link one of the articles that I read that I was looking into it, but they're finding that synchrony between brains has benefits. It's linked to better problem solving, learning and cooperation, and even with behaviors that help others at a personal cost. What's more, recent studies in which brains were stimulated with an electric current hint that synchrony itself might cause the improved performance observed by scientists. Cognition is something that happens not just in the school, but in connection with the environment and with other people, said Guillaume Dumas, a professor of computational psychiatry at the University of Montreal. Understanding when and how our brains synchronize could help us communicate more efficiently, design better classrooms, and help teams cooperate. And I'm going to add, become better storytellers and public speakers. And they start talking about, if you walk next to someone, you're likely to begin walking in step. You've noticed that, right? Or if someone puts their hand on their cheek as you're telling a story, you might do that. If they start leaning over to the left, maybe you'll mirror them. It's something that I think we do without even noticing, but research shows that it makes us more trusting. It helps us bond and turns up our sociable instincts. In one study, dancing in sync made participants feel emotionally close to one another, much more so than groups that moved asynchronously. In another study, participants who chanted words rhythmically were more likely to cooperate in an investment game. Coordination is a hallmark of social interaction. It's really crucial. When coordination is impaired, social interaction is deeply impaired. So think about this coordination, this aspect of coordination in your storytelling. What does that actually mean? Is there something that you can get people to do right at the beginning, right? I'm just thinking out loud here. But I always say that at the very beginning, let's have a unifying experience, something that will connect us all. And it can be, hey, look at the time, right? And we all physically turn our bodies to look at the clock that's behind at the back of the room. Creating a unifying experience could actually be better stated as find a point of coordination. Find a point of coordination between you and your audience to enhance that connection. That is so amazing to me. Like it could be a movement, right? Have people make some type of movement that everybody could do. And keeping in mind and provide people different ways to interact with that movement as well, right? But think about how one coordinated movement at the very beginning of your speech or at the very beginning of your story, right? For example, if I'm telling the story about me dribbling the ball, might I be able to, I'll dribble the ball, I shoot, and then I look at my audience, right? Is there something there that they could potentially also do? Is maybe can I have them, I think raising our hands might be the easiest one, but that's not always, I don't think it's the most interactive one because there are people that hold back from raising their hands. So have people do some kind of coordinated movement and think about what that is going to do to basically your brains being like neural coupling so that y'all have similar reactions from that moment forward as you're telling your story to deepen that connection. That is so cool. That's hella cool. And again, this is new research. This is research that there's continued research in this field, right? So I don't think that there is one specific thing that you can do that automatically will get everybody to sync up because that would be freaking amazing and transformational. But there is research being done in this field, which means that it is possible. And maybe it depends on your audience size, right? Who knows? You might be able to do it with 20 people, but maybe not when it gets to the thousands. And maybe within those thousands, though, you might be able to get 1/3 of the people. So this is hella cool. I think it's so awesome the way that our brain works, and specifically the way that storytelling activates these things for us and can potentially this is how storytelling transforms our world. I'm nerding out, y'all. This is freaking amazing. Okay, and I'll just do maybe one more point that I want to add, but with storytelling, I think I mentioned this during the thinking about dopamine, right? And the neurochemical that happens there. But storytelling can help you retain information because you can tell me all the facts, you can tell me all the data, but a story is going to make me feel something, become emotionally attached to something, and therefore remember it. Whether it's I remember the feeling that you sharing that data had on me because you added a storytelling element to it, you added a personal touch to it. There was something emotionally attached to that data. It wasn't just the data. And our brain actually organizes it in that way, right? Our brain will organize a story structure and it makes it easier for us to recall. So if you're telling me a story, instead of giving me bullet points of data, if you make that data and transform it into into an actual story, I'm going to remember it because I'm going to say, okay, at the very beginning, they started with, did you know that X amount of people are introverts? And then they gave me a story that made that data point stick. And then before moving into the next data point, they gave me a story leading up to that data point, which makes that data point stick. So the data is sticking not because of the data itself, but because of the story that you're telling and that's attached to it. We are creating associations and emotional connections to those things, which will help us remember them. So when you're sharing data, because data is incredibly powerful and data can enhance your story, think about how you're immersing the data within the story and what specific emotional connection you're attaching to that data to make it memorable for people. Because si la gente no se acuerda, if people can't remember what you're saying, ¿de qué nos sirve? Right? Yes, of course. No, it does do us good to share and continue to share our stories because at least one person out there will connect to it. But our role as public speakers is to tell stories, to share information, to be effective in our communication. And I think measuring effectiveness in communication can be very different for many different people. And I actually would love to do a separate podcast on this, but measuring your effective communication, it has a lot to do with how much people remember. That is one of the biggest things for me. What do people remember and what action were they inspired to take, right? So I'll do a deeper dive into that. My rubric for my own speaking and when I put speeches together, this is what I keep in mind. But with that being said, I hope you found some of this stuff interesting. I definitely did. I nerd out about it. And next week for my solo podcast episode, we're actually going to talk about ethical storytelling. So if you are interested in that, keep an eye out for that one next week as well. I hope you enjoyed this episode, learned something new, are inspired to dig deeper into something, and that I planted a seed of curiosity, and specifically around storytelling, that you understand the power of storytelling, but even more so what's actually happening in our brains when it's happening, and the things that we could evoke in other folks, and the emotions and senses and memories that are being evoked in our own brains and bodies when we're telling our story. With that being said, if you are a part of an organization and would like to have a storytelling workshop, I do offer my signature topic, storytelling like our abuelitas. This is specifically tapping into our essence as a speaker and really using our own lived experiences to tell a story. How do you figure out what stories to tell, which ones are most impactful, and why you want to tell that particular story? It's called storytelling like our abuelitas because I always say that the women in my lives and my abuelita specifically taught me pretty much everything that I needed to know about public speaking and who I am within the art. So I'd love to bring this to your organizations if it is something that you are interested in. If you are an individual and are interested in public speaking workshops, I have virtual Latina Presente workshops every single month on the third Wednesday of the month. So keep an eye out for our next one. The one in August is all around putting together academic presentations. So we'll talk about some tips and tricks that I have around that and really what it requires, because it is a little bit different than the storytelling element, right? But there is still should be storytelling embedded within it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The cards, my public speaking practice cards, are launching August 1st, so 2 days from now officially. You can check that out on the chatswithyvonne.com website. The link will be in this podcast episode. And keep an eye out for more updates on Instagram. I do have another launch of something really special coming through. And if you ever find yourself wanting to dive deeper into the art of public speaking and really practice, I offer feedback sessions where we sit together for an hour. You come prepared with your speech or whatever it is that you're preparing for, and I give you live feedback. I think feedback and practice are one of the best ways to get better at your public speaking, and I'm happy to be your partner. Y ahí se acabó. Y ahí se acabó. Like I always like to say, if you enjoyed this episode, remember to share it with your moms, your tías, your sisters, your cousins, your amigas, everybody and their mamas. Y nos vemos a la próxima.